Thanks so much. It's so exciting to be here to present this paper. This is kind of the amalgamation of a lot of different ideas I've been thinking about for a while. So I'm really excited to hear what everyone thinks and any thoughts you might have on directions to go forward with this. So this paper today focuses not on Kropotkin, but on Hobbes in sort of a parallel way to the discussion about a pandemic state of nature. So I'll just start off by giving sort of an overview of the pandemic as a social dilemma. So the COVID-19 pandemic was a complex social dilemma that threatened the whole world. The fact that COVID-19 is an infectious disease necessarily led to the pandemic being a challenge that's social in nature, as the actions of individuals directly affect others in society. COVID-19 pandemic represents specifically a public goods game. The public good of safety in regard to one's health is vitally important, but can only be provided to everyone in society as a result of the cooperative effort of a critical number of people engaging in socially responsible behavior. If an insufficient number of people engage in such behavior, public safety will be undermined, as it is necessary for the majority of people in a population to contribute in order for safety to be facilitated. Thus, an opportunity to free ride, in other words, to benefit from others' cooperation without oneself contributing, arises insofar as individuals can reap the benefits of public safety without having to engage in the necessary behavior. Individuals are faced with the choice of engaging in self-interested behavior while still enjoying the public good of safety versus contributing to the public good through the necessary behavior. And this necessary behavior does come at a cost. Physical distancing may involve reducing contact with the people one loves, wearing a mask can be uncomfortable, etc. Thus, individuals have reasons to prefer refraining from engaging in such behavior. Furthermore, the risks and rewards of complying with the socially responsible behavior required to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 differ between individuals. Young individuals, for example, are at less of a risk of suffering serious health complications from contracting COVID-19 than older people are those with underlying health conditions. Thus, they have less motivation to adhere to the necessary measures to promote public safety, as they do not benefit as much from such a good. The free rider problem poses a serious challenge to society's successful battling of the pandemic. If individuals choose to free ride, not only will they be benefiting unjustly from the cooperative effort of others, but such cooperation will eventually break down, putting everyone at risk. Free riding behavior elicits negative emotions from cooperators insofar as they perceive they're being treated unfairly, which slowly halts overall cooperative behavior. Thus, if free riders are perceived to exist in society, cooperators will stop contributing, eventually driving cooperation to zero. We can conceive of this situation of turmoil as a modern state of nature, wherein agents, for their own safety, must work together to bring about a public good. However, the relevant actions depend on a radical and immediate shift in behavior and social norms, departing from pre-existing habits. The manner in which this situation might come about is subject to great variation across different societies and states, with some approaches entailing coercive force from governments, while others relying on signaling and gentle nudging from political authorities. These different approaches are reflective of what I hold to be assumptions held by the state about the cooperativeness of citizens and their proclivity to engage voluntarily in socially responsible behavior. Thus, in this state of nature, individual action within society is what is at play regarding how to deal with this social threat. The manner in which this threat is dealt with, I argue, depends upon beliefs about the propensity of others to engage in socially responsible behavior that would benefit society overall. These circumstances, I argue, represent re-examinations of what the social contract should entail and how it should be successfully executed. The core question at the heart of forming this new social contract, I hold, is firstly, whether agents would enter into it voluntarily. Recall, not everyone benefits to the same degree from the public good of health. And secondly, which won't be the topic of this paper, is whether they will do so for self-interested versus other regarding reasons. This contemporary social dilemma embodies a conflict between short-term self-interest and long-term collective interest. Certain governments, like that of Australia, seem to hold the assumption that everyone who would not benefit from the good of minimizing the spread of COVID-19 would not enter into this new form of social contract, which consists of socially responsible behavior, and thus took a Hobbesian approach to instituting the new contract in the form of strict coercive measures with mandatory curfews, mask wearing, and where I live in Melbourne, the most days in lockdown around the world. Other governments, such as that of Sweden, seem to hold a different conception about the cooperative inclinations of individuals in society. Sweden relied primarily on subtle nudges from the government, entailing recommendations for socially responsible behavior, using messages imploring others to take responsibility into their own hands and act for the good of the overall community. So this is what I roughly hold to be the case in regard to the assumptions that the Australian and Swedish governments held. The social contract, however, of course, includes individuals in the state as members of the contracting parties. So in forming the beliefs of individuals, I hold, relevant considerations include the level of perceived trust in others to comply with the necessary measures voluntarily, as well as trust in political authorities to facilitate necessary behavioral changes without unjustifiably overexerting their power to interfere in the lives and freedom of individuals. This deliberation has sparked high levels of tension and unrest in society, with people questioning the justifiability of the government imposing on their freedom to such a significant degree, which I posit reflects their varying views of others' propensity to cooperate. Those who trust others to voluntarily comply with the relevant behaviors, or those who believe that social pressures, such as moral shaming or reputational damage, would be sufficient to produce societal conditions that would reduce free riding and facilitate necessary behavior, may feel that state regulations are less necessary or not necessary at all, and would see the imposition of constraints, such as lockdown or curfews, as unjustifiable limits on freedom. On the contrary, those who do not trust others to comply are likely to support authoritative measures to enforce cooperation to facilitate the common good. Such attitudes may certainly change throughout the pandemic as individuals are able to observe the behavior of others and reevaluate their understandings of individuals' tendencies to cooperate, and thus redefine their conception of the pandemic state of nature and the justifiable role of the state within it. If agents are seen to tend towards voluntary compliance, perhaps support for the state's involvement will diminish. Whereas if the opposite is seen to occur, a rally around the flag effect might occur, generating support for political intervention and coercive measures. I will now engage in a speculative exercise in trying to explore what assumptions about human cooperation, and thus the basis of the social contract, were taken to be the case in the pandemic state of nature in Australia and Sweden. I have chosen these two states, as alluded to before, because they undertook very different approaches to combating the pandemic, which I believe reflect different assumptions about the nature of cooperation within the relevant societies. The Australian government engaged in a very strict pandemic plan involving enforced lockdowns, business and school closures, etc., very early on in the pandemic. This approach reflects somewhat of a Hobbesian assumption about the state of nature, i.e., that individuals would only cooperate if it was in their best interest to do so, and thus, for overarching compliance to be generated, an overarching power would need to be created, and this quote from Hobbes, in order to hold people in awe and tie them by fear of punishment to the performance of their covenants, which in this case is covenanting to act in a socially responsible manner to impede the spread of COVID-19. Such an approach reflects a Hobbesian understanding of agents' motivation to enter into the social contract out of the state of nature for self-interested concern for their safety. But how would this come about in the modern state of nature during the pandemic when everyone does not face the same threat? I argue that such a contract would represent a modern version of the social contract, wherein people are forced to acquiesce to the contract in order to protect everyone in society, as underscored by liberal democratic values. This seems to be a potentially unilaterally renewed version of the social contract via the government, rather than an entirely new contract built between citizens and the state. Sweden took a very different approach to the pandemic, which centered upon individuals taking responsibility upon themselves to act towards the good of society and exercise personal judgment about measures necessary to promote public health. In implementing their plan, the Swedish government primarily relied on the assumption that individuals would voluntarily adapt their behavior, rather than enforcing such behavior through political force. Swedish residents were allowed to move freely within the community, Restaurants and bars were kept open as long as there was proper distance between the tables. There were no lockdowns, but people were urged to stay home if they felt unwell, and those who could work from home were urged to do so. Only a very limited number of measures, strict measures were put in place, such as, for example, bans on gatherings of more than 50 people. In the dialogue that the government engaged in, recommendations were issued in phrases such as keep a distance from one another, to keep a suitable distance, or to keep a sensible distance, reflecting their idea that individuals ought to make their own judgments upon what is a safe, appropriate distance. And in certain high-risk periods, such as the Easter of 2020, recommendations went along the lines of think about whether this trip is necessary or whether you could save it for next Easter. It is also additionally interesting to note that the government did emphasize that tougher measures would be introduced unless the necessary behaviors were engaged in. This liberal strategy was modeled in accordance with the norms of Swedish culture and social behavior, with a joke being made that when the 2-meter rule was no longer recommended, Swedes could go back to the usual 5-meter distance. Swedish society has high trust both in terms of interpersonal and institutional trust, which was drawn upon to impose informal, mostly unregulated coordination, illuminating, I hold, assumptions that people would selflessly act to promote the public good when necessary. This subtle and non-coercive approach to governance throughout the pandemic was contentiously debated, with some labeling this approach as a reckless experiment with people's lives. At certain times, such as the spring of 2020, Sweden had some of the highest COVID death rates in Europe, which gave the impression that their approach was severely failing. Such circumstances, I hold, led opponents from states who took a more coercive approach to the pandemic to assume that Sweden had misjudged the tendencies of its citizens to voluntarily engage in the necessary precautions. However, the findings from the Corona Commission, which was an independent body formed by the government under pressure from Parliament to evaluate the response to the pandemic, concluded that, and this is a quote, the choice of path in terms of disease prevention and control, focusing on advice and recommendations, which people were expected to follow voluntarily, was fundamentally correct. It meant that citizens retained more of their personal freedom than in many other countries, and many countries that have pursued other approaches have experienced significantly worse outcomes than Sweden, indicating at present, at least, that it is highly uncertain what effect lockdowns did in fact have. In hindsight, it seems as though assumptions regarding cooperation amongst individuals in society were not entirely relevant to promoting the public good of safety, as the state of nature, as I call it, throughout the pandemic was carried out with similar outcomes in terms of relative cases, regardless of state intervention. Although Sweden suffered high levels of cases early on in the pandemic, it appears that this was partially a result of other countries managing to delay cases rather than preventing them from occurring. And by the end of the pandemic, Sweden's case numbers ended up being comparable to other Nordic countries and relatively low when compared to other European countries. Such data stood in the face of the scrutiny that Sweden faced in the assumption that they had willingly sacrificed lives as a part of their pandemic plan. However, while the pandemic seemed to result in similar outcomes overall, individuals living in Sweden during the pandemic had their freedom impeded upon in less severe ways overall than individuals in other countries. At the heart of the Swedish approach to the pandemic was a belief that lockdowns were not a sustainable long-term strategy, as not only would they cause a great deal of suffering, but individuals would inevitably refuse to be controlled in this way for prolonged periods and would end up inevitably violating restrictions. Underscoring the Swedish approach as well was a skepticism regarding the justifiability of long-term and recurring lockdowns and restricting people's freedom, and held as a fundamental tenet that certain types of behavior during the pandemic could never be successfully banned, but rather a more effective way of enacting socially responsible behavior would be to foster an attitude of common sense and responsibility, such that citizens would regulate their own behavior in relation to fellow members of their society, viewed in the light of acts of solidarity and moral obligation in the absence of strict laws. This approach, they held, would be more effective in the long run and would help retain citizens' loyalty and trust in their government, as the state would refrain from policing individuals' lives in too intimate a manner. This question regarding the justifiability of impeding on individuals' freedom has been at the forefront of recent public debate and has caused significant turmoil and protest, even violent protest, in response to restrictions that have been imposed around the world. The pandemic posed a question to society about their views of what the modern-day social contract ought to consist of, specifically in relation to the question of how much the state ought to be permitted to interfere in the lives of citizens and on what grounds. In these circumstances, deep values were tested and challenged, such as trust in government as well as trust in other people in society. The question regarding to what degree a government ought to wield its power, the power it possesses, in infringing upon individuals' freedom in response to a social threat, is at the heart of the social contract debates regarding measures taken throughout the pandemic. It seems that different modern states, such as Sweden and Australia, perhaps held different conceptions regarding agents' proclivity towards engaging in the necessary behaviors voluntarily versus the need for such behaviors to be enforced through political authority, which informed their different views of the modern social contract that was enacted during the pandemic. While most states characterized Sweden's pandemic approach as a dangerous experiment, the nature of the Swedish response was actually to stay true to their already existing social contract, built primarily on voluntary rather than coercive measures, and to which citizens had already theoretically agreed to and were mostly happy with. One of Norway's recent state epidemiologists provided an explanation of why Sweden might have been judged so harshly at the outset for the strategy it undertook. And this is a quote. "I think it may be because everyone was unsure of what the right response was to the pandemic, and yet almost everyone at the same time chose to do long, hard lockdowns early on. Sweden became the contrast they did not want. Sweden undermined their mantra that we had no choice and forced them to explain to their citizens why they did what they did. For these colleagues, it would have been better if everyone had done the same. They hid their own insecurities by lambasting Sweden. Thus, it seems as though it was not Sweden, but many other states around the world that engaged in an unprecedented experiment in their pandemic plans, which involved a significant revision of the social contract, involving serious limitations on freedom without much upside in terms of long-term success in combating the virus, and which generated much pushback from certain segments of the population in regard to freedom being impeded. Contrastingly, Sweden's social contract throughout the pandemic seemingly did not alter considerably, relying on citizens' relationship with their fellow contract members to engage in the necessary behavior instead of falling back into a vicious state of nature without having to create a revised version of the social contract." Thank you.
I live in Florida. And so I think I'm thinking about okay, so your argument sort of makes sense to me. It's like a political scientist, like low social capital equals the felt need for strong state response. But in the US, there was an epistemic dimension to it, which was some people, believed a certain thing about the virus and some people didn't believe the same thing. And so there's, at least in the US and especially in Florida, there's a whole crisis over scientific authority. I think Hobbes is fantastic for this dynamic of the question. So I wondered if you had explored that, like the epistemic dimension is not just social trust, but trust in science.
I haven't, so that's kind of another level I need to think more about, and it's really interesting dimension. And I think that one aspect that I have thought about sort of briefly is when I talk about trust in governments, I also am discussing not only trust that governments won't overexert their power, but also the trust in governments that they have the correct scientific information, or they're at least relying on accurate scientific information. So Sweden, one of the hallmarks of their approach was actually a reliance really fundamentally on the public health agency's recommendations. So it seemed like in Sweden, it was actually the public health agency that was driving the pandemic plan rather than just political authority, as it were. So I think that this would be also really interesting in terms of citizens' perceptions of the government and whether the government is being epistemically responsible. I wonder if that would also influence the sort of social contracts dialogue.
Would you like a follow-up?
No.
No. Okay. Yeah.
Yes. So thank you for very interesting paper. I guess my question is, I think there's a room to extend since you related this whole pandemic situation, social contract to Hobbes, I think there's elements in Hobbes's work that you can really extend. For example, I can think of like his argument that people are myopic. They don't really know what's there good for them, and that's why you need the sovereign to push it. And I think it's an interesting case because I think part of the argument is that even the government doesn't know what's really good for the long term. So that's one possible just concept, and also his concept of liberty, that his movement and lockdown is basically, I think, a violation of very Hobbesian notion of liberty. So I guess the question, the point I want to push is, I think there's like a lot of elements in Hobbes's argument that you can really apply to this.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. I mean, those are really interesting areas to further explore. Especially that first point when you were talking about sort of this sort of paternalistic element of knowing what's good for others, which obviously one wants to avoid, and governments ought not take that role in governance. And then it's interesting when I was discussing the sort of unilateral imposition of this renewed social contract to protect all in society as a sort of a different face of this unilateral exertion of power, actually on the basis of these liberal democratic values of the equal sort of worth and everyone's right to engage to partake in this public good of safety. So yeah, I think that I have a lot more thinking to do on that. Thank you.
I don't remember why this is the case, and maybe I didn't catch it in your paper. Why were there so many deaths in Sweden? Is it unknown or is it known? You're saying it wasn't because of the unenforced policies, but what was the cause of it, or do we know?
Well, from what I understand, it's that the spread just occurred faster at the beginning because there wasn't as strict, there weren't lockdowns as such. So I'm just the different sort of ways in which the virus worked through the population was more prolonged in other places that had these restrictions kind of keeping it at bay. And then as they would as the restrictions would be sort of decrease and people or new viruses or different strains emerged, there was that sort of more gradual spread instead of the initial sort of drastic spread in Sweden that was uncontrolled, sort of, as it were.
So what was the total, is there a way to compare those two different spreads? Did Sweden fare any better overall than some other comparable countries?
Yeah, there's a lot of the numbers that I don't have handy, but yes, I think Sweden, it wasn't in terms of relative case to population numbers. Sweden was not fared pretty well very well against other countries in Europe, and comparatively well to other sort of Nordic countries, and not even at the sort of worst of those countries.
Okay, and so are you saying that's they fared better overall in part because of the non-enforced lockdowns and the affirmation of a certain culturally accepted social contract?
No, I'm not, because I'm not a scientist, so I can't connect the why they fared better with their pandemic plan as such. But what I'm interested in is that the end results were that they seem to fare, let's just say, equally to other countries in that region. And they had this different sort of view of the social contract throughout this pandemic state of nature. And they were criticized quite harshly for that at the time. So I thought that this was interesting to think about how maybe people in other countries were thinking about their social contracts during this time versus Sweden, and how we sort of looked upon Sweden as that sort of unique case that decided to sort of change things.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. Thank you for bringing us all back to the forum. Pandemic era.
where everybody was like that Spinoza, like in Spinoza's ethics, we all thought we were kings, even though we were determined from the outside. Meaning, like I don't remember really what. So thanks for giving me more information than I had on Sweden, because I remember that. Because like it basically what I meant by everybody declares themselves a king, even when they have, is because like in Florida, a great example, right? Like you have some sort of random difference of your population, and then you're like, it's because we put the color purple curtains up or something like that. It was just and Sweden was something similar, and I don't know, like, so that helped me, because I remember Sweden came up because like, oh, they're letting everybody out, and of course they didn't report all the other things that were being done in terms of mitigation. So but my question is more broad, very very broad, which is the first where we're starting, which is using this as a figure of the state of nature. And I just wanted you to talk about that maybe a little bit more. Like why would the pandemic be a state of nature? I hate to be the guy who goes, and tell me about your title. I got that far, but does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that, actually, because thinking about that pandemic as the state of nature, I think is one of my sort of favorite aspects of the papers, because I think it's an interesting way to think about this sort of social dilemma that arose, where there's a threat that is not very often seen to the world overall, well, yes, and or to societies at large, that sort of we as a cooperatively have to decide upon as or face as a society. And the reason I thought of it as sort of the state of nature was that there are a lot of it changed the nature of what was right and wrong in the relation to the virus. So all of a sudden meeting your friend for coffee was actually moral wrongdoing, where these things that were sort of social norms and habits were greatly altered, and there needed to be a new set of rules enforced and decided upon by the population. And then, which is why I was looking at the social contract, and then decided upon the population, and then decided whether or not they needed to be enforced strictly by the government or not. So I think that this is where this sort of state of nature dialogues occurs. Like in the state of nature, people all covenant to either give their sort of free will to the sovereign to make sure everyone complies, or they think that there's maybe a more communal arrangement that can be created. But so that's the sort of.
No, I'm not looking quizzically. I'm just trying to think it through, because you're right. Like in a moment, like what Hannah Arendt writes about revolutionary moments, like everything disappeared. Like that first couple of weeks.
Yeah.
You don't know what happened. And it is certainly like, because I'm like, that's not a state of nature, because you're talking a lot about governance. But in a way, like we all realize we don't have a social contract. Yeah. Like that was, so what do we have, right? Like we thought, like, if you were naive, like you might have even or dare dream, like, well, in moments of death, these crazies will get the shot, you know what I mean, like, or do something. But you realize there was nothing, and we have created a non-contractual. Yeah. Okay. No, that's now I'm getting it. Yeah. No, that was very helpful. Thank you for that.
I've got something clumsily. My question is in relation to cooperation and free riding, and it's sort of to raise a potential problem, not with your argument, but with the very concept of cooperation and free riding, and to invite you to comment on it if you'd like to. And it's that the issue perhaps is not in fact cooperation, but it is the perception of cooperation. I think you did touch on this. So buy-in doesn't need people to cooperate. It needs everybody to think everybody else is cooperating. And that's all you need. And it's this issue of people will conform to what they think other people are doing. There's this famous case, and I don't know the details, but there was this electricity company that wanted people to use less electricity. They tried various different ways of doing it. None of them worked. And then they had this idea of a mail shop which said, look how much your neighbors are saving. Like your neighbors are saving this much energy, like 20% of their energy, whatever it was. And energy use shot down with that because people perceived others around them to be behaving in a certain way, and that shaped their behavior. Now, I don't know in that case whether the neighbors were actually using less electricity or not, but I don't think for the sake of the example, they don't need to have been using less electricity. And so to what extent do you think that reality poses a problem for the cooperation thesis? Because if, you know, the government can convince people that other people are behaving in a certain way, then that's all you need to do. And that becomes very insidious very quickly.
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic to think about. Thank you for that. That's and you're exactly right that it can be really dangerous if this perception can generate so much power in motivating different people's behaviors. And it's an interesting sort of aspect to that second question of when I was dividing up the two questions about the social contract in relation to the state of nature is, would people enter it? And then the second part was, for what reasons, self-interested or other regarding reasons. So it could be the case that perhaps agents would enter into the state of nature for self-interested reasons, for their own benefit. But whether it needs to be the case that they do it for others, the end result remains the same. So I think that that's sort of an interesting thing to think about, that this social contract, which does produce this public good, can actually be quite pernicious in the motivations that underlie it. And also that it can be used in other ways, this sort of motivational power. But yeah, I think that that's a really interesting aspect of the nature of why people are adhering to the social contract. What are the motivations underlying it, even if the end result is beneficial?
Yeah, thank you. Flora has a question.
Yes, thank you. So I'll try to articulate my question in spite of the migraine, but and I had promised myself not to bring up Rousseau, but I think I'm going to do it nonetheless. Because I mean, I find your hypothesis of the pandemic as the state of nature very stimulating, but I'm not sure I'm completely convinced, because I mean, it is a state of nature in the sense that it was a situation when we realized, oh, there's no common norm. So I get that part, if that's, you know, what your argument, but it's also a state of nature that springs out of you know, globalized economy, and that's the reason why the pandemic spread so quickly, is because, you know, there was all this, you know, volume of economic exchanges, which is anything but natural. And so I think if we want to see the pandemic as a state of nature, it's very much the sort of state of nature which Rousseau describes at the very end of the second discourse, i.e., you know, a society that is so civilized that it actually brings up a sort of new state of nature, which, with the difference that this is much worse. So that would be, I don't know if you would agree with that account. And I also wanted to give you a reference. Maybe the philosopher Barbara Stiegler could be helpful. I don't think most of her work is translated in English, but she wrote in French a very good brochure entitled "About Democracy in Pandemic," in a pandemic. And one of her books, which is translated in English, is Adapt with an exclamation mark, which does not directly deal with the pandemic, but retraces how over the 20th century, a sort of governmental ideology of constant adaptation has developed, and that maybe you could relate that to the pandemic as well.
Oh, thank you so much. That sounds exactly, that sounds really helpful to my work. So thank you. I'm definitely going to look into that, because that is sort of the constant adaptation is what I sort of characterize this new social contract as. It's not a new contract, so much as we were talking earlier in the day about sort of a constantly revised sort of contract that's in flux. And in regard to that's your first point, I did try to allude to that sort of aspect of the social contract, in that it is very different from our original or from the idea of the original social contract that occurs in this state of nature without any government that has existed as of yet. And I do think that this is, in a certain way, slightly more pernicious state of nature as well. I certainly agree with that, because when I mentioned earlier that the Swedish government did threaten, it seems, in a way, its citizens with compliance. And I think that this is an interesting thing, is because Sweden didn't institute these strict regulations, but there was this threat that if people didn't voluntarily comply, they would institute strict regulations. So how free this state of nature is quite uncertain. So it seems like this is, like you said, taking place within a context of a globalized world, which is ruled throughout various means. So this state of nature is very unique in that it's not an entirely free state of nature. It's within sort of this already constrained world. So it's kind of a different iteration of the state of nature, which is sort of a scary thought as well, that this, even in conditions where there's this unprecedented threat or this unprecedented circumstances, that individuals are still sort of constrained, even in these sort of deliberations of societal threats and existential deliberations.
Thank you.
Chris, can I just ask
Quickly.
So one quick thing might be, so we seem to be, Flora's question is really good, and I was thinking along similar lines. But what I was thinking, as you were answering, I was thinking, well, you don't need to ontologically say this is the state of nature, what contract. Like, in other words, as long as we were practically engaged in the world as if it was a state of nature, and that seems to have been done, right? In other words, maybe we don't need you to like prove, hey, like there was no contract involved, or in some way, you don't need to do all that, because it certainly felt to most of us like, oh God, everything's falling away, right? And we're a state of nature. And so that might be an approach to like sort of lessen the work you have to do to get all those sources for that, that sort of thing. But that's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's I think that's exactly spot on with what sort of my aim is to do, is not to sort of posit that this is like the state of nature before, as it originally is sort of characterized, but it's a sort of a modern state of nature, a modern version, where these sort of, there are different parameters to it.
Please join me in thanking